June 1967. The Arab world were about to witness 6 of the most unforgiving, decisive days, arguably, in its history. These 6 days which concussed the Arab world. These fragile 6 days which allowed for the 56-year-long occupation of Al-Aqsa. The ramifications of these 6 days can still be felt to this very day in the bombings of Gaza and the subjugation of the West Bank. Today, in the final installment of How Palestine Was Lost, we'll be uncovering the truth about the 1967 Six-Day War, as well as the wars which Israel would wage against its neighbors after the 1967 war. So the historical narrative will be ending at around the 1980s mark, purely because after the 1990s, we see a completely new and different era. We see the return of Palestinian homegrown resistance. We see the return of the intifadas, which is the resistance against the Israeli occupation regime. And after the 1990s, we start to see less of that large-scale Arab to Israel interventions and a large-scale war. So we will end at around the 1980s to the 1990s mark. So this is quite an emotional lecture for me. One, because of course this is the final installment of the series of How Palestine Was Lost, but also because this is my final lecture ever, because my time in uni is slowly coming to a halt. So this is probably the last lecture room that I'm ever going to be stepping foot in. So a little bit of an emotional one for me, a little bit personal as well. But nevertheless, if you never hear from me again, there's a few ways in which you can keep up to date with what I'm doing and also support the work that I do. So I mentioned in the first lecture that I'm a video journalist, independent. I don't work for the BBC, so don't worry. Nevertheless, I talk about topics which my counterpart at the BBC would never dare to discuss. That is the Muslim tragedies since 1924. So I go to different countries, I report on the ground. I've been to Iraq, Palestine as well, Bosnia, Kosovo, in the documentary. So I implore you all to watch that and also to subscribe to the Journal Harris channel. You also have then my article website. So whenever I go abroad and I report, I always like to write an article. And if you're not a fan of watching videos, you can have a look at the articles. The articles some of them are quite interesting, some of them are quite comedic. So if you enjoy reading, then I'm sure you'll like the few articles that are written over on my article website. And then finally, we have, so like I mentioned, I focus on the Muslim tragedies of recent times since the end of the Ottomans. So I don't know if any of you know, when did the Ottoman Empire, or when did the Khilafah, when was it abolished? 1924. No, 1924. And what date? Close. What date was it?
3rd of March.
Yes, good lad. So it was actually a few days ago. It was a centennial, 100 years since the end of the Ottoman Empire. And so I've done a research poster on this. It took me a long time to compile a list of tragedies of the Muslim world. So you can find that hopefully on my article website, maybe on my YouTube channel. But if you want a proper copy of that, it's obviously hard to read. But I'm just going to read you the first date on this poster of the Muslim tragedies. So from 1821 to 1926, you have 5.5 million Muslims expelled from the Balkans. These are the Ottoman territories. So during the exodus of the Ottomans, you have 5.5 million Muslims expelled from Europe, and you have another 5.5 million massacred and killed. So this is just the first date. Imagine all the other dates. Some of the places that we might not even know, from the Philippines to Cambodia, and of course to Palestine. So recap time, you know the script. Okay, so basically that's just a quick wrap up of what happened. Essentially we talked about the Nakba, the foundation of Israel. The recording is actually online, so if anybody missed the last lecture, you can actually go online. It took me ages to make the thing. So let's just have a look at the map and see where we are. So far, we're in the run-up to the infamous date, 1967. Jordan, from 1948 all the way up until 1967, has control of the West Bank. And what's in the West Bank that we love? The third holy site in Islam? Al-Aqsa, of course. And then the Egyptians have control over Gaza. This is the political map currently as we are. So Israel never really took its eyes off of the lands of Egypt. So as we mentioned, we had the Suez crisis, where Gamal Abdel Nasser is invaded by the Israelis, and they take the entirety of the Sinai Peninsula, but then they're forced to actually flee under international pressure. So Israel is now strategizing another big maneuver to take back their lands which they had taken, the Sinai Peninsula. So they begin to strategize this big next move that would annihilate the Arab world. And this maneuver was known as Operation Focus, a very elaborate scheme to wipe out the entirety of the Arab world's air force, every single airbase, every single jet, every single aircraft, everything would be targeted in Operation Focus. The Israeli jets would fly by over Egypt, they would fly by over Jordan and Syria, and literally surgically wipe out every single air base, every single aircraft of these armies. That was the plan of Operation Focus. So the Israelis realized that if they're going to get in a fight with the Arabs next, they don't just want to defeat them, but they want to annihilate them from the face of this earth. That way, Israel can then move into these lands and create their so-called Greater Israeli State. If you remember from the first, I believe it's the second lecture, we discussed this idea of creating a Greater Israeli State. So this is going to be made evident in the 1967 war and every war after that. Israel has this idea that it needs to invade these countries, bring them to their knees, and then implement a pro-Israeli regime into these countries. Like Lebanon is one of the examples that we're going to discuss. So now, Israel needs a pretext for this Operation Focus. So they begin to have border skirmishes with Syria. It's really funny because the Israelis get like random farmers and they get them on tractors and they tell them to just drive through the Israeli-Syrian border at the top there. So of course this is provocative. These are just random farmers. They don't know what they're doing. They're just being instructed to drive across the border. And so Syria knows exactly what they're trying to do. They're trying to provoke them because Israel needs a pretext to launch this massive operation. So Nasser understands what's going on. He prepares 130,000 troops and he actually moves in to the Sinai Peninsula and he expels the UN supervisors in the region. Why is that a problem? What happened after 1956? Yes, so the UN, so Nasser was only able to take back the Sinai Peninsula if he ensured that he would not put his military into the region. And now Nasser moves his troops into the Sinai Peninsula once again. And he then closes the Straits of Tiran. War is now on the horizon and we're counting down to the day of the infamous 1967 war. So Israel begins to jam the radar sets at the US Embassy in Tel Aviv. Why would they jam the US radar sets? Well, essentially the Israelis don't want the Americans to be alerted of this surprise attack. Because you've got to remember, even though the Americans are the new allies, by the way, I also needed to mention, after the Suez Crisis, someone also asked me the other day, after the Suez Crisis, Britain and France are no longer the sponsors of Zionism. Their empires, essentially it was the Suez Crisis was indicative of the failures of the British and French. And so after that very moment, the Americans would be the new sponsors of Zionism. Just how Napoleon had been the sponsors of Zionism. Just how after Napoleon, after he was rendered irrelevant, then it was the British. After the British, then it was the Americans. So during this time, after 1956, the Americans are the new backers of Israel. So the Americans, the Israelis don't want the Americans to be alerted of this massive operation. Why? Because at the end of the day, the Americans would pressure the Israelis to not wage this war because there was a chance that Israel was actually not going to make it out of this war alive. You've got to remember, this is a bold move. It's literally facing head on the entirety of the Arab world. So there's a chance that Israel is not going to make it out of this skirmish alive. And so the Americans, if they were ever to find out about this operation, they would of course oppose it. And just like how they opposed the Israeli occupation of the Sinai Peninsula, the only reason Israel was driven out of the Sinai Peninsula in 1956 was because of international pressure. So Israel wants to ensure that nobody knows about this surprise attack. And so, on the 5th of June 1967, despite telling the Americans they wouldn't strike first, Israel declares an expansionist illegal war. Within moments, in fact within hours, 80% of Egypt's air force completely flattened without leaving them any room to react. Jordan, Iraq, Syria, they also joined the fight, but once again, their air forces are decimated. The Israeli jets swoop over all of their airfields and surgically wipe out their entire air force. And once again, Egypt had been rendered defenseless. And without air support, Israel moves into the Sinai Peninsula and Egypt retreats from the Sinai Peninsula. Now you have, once again, for the first time since 1956, the Israelis moving back into their promised lands of the Sinai Peninsula. And as they move their tanks, steamroll across the Sinai Peninsula, they mutilate the bodies of civilians, they mutilate the bodies of soldiers. And so 2 days, my friends, 2 days is all it took for Israel to bring the Arab world to its knees. As we mentioned, this is the bombing run, very beautifully animated. So Israel swoops around and bombs all of these air forces, and then Egypt is forced to flee from the Sinai Peninsula, and then Israel, of course, moves in. But why does this impact the story of us, the Palestinians? What does this have, what impact or what effect does this have on the life of the Palestinians? We mentioned that Egypt is out of the fight now. They have completely surrendered. They don't have air support, so there's no way they can support the sustenance of the Sinai Peninsula, the defense of the Sinai Peninsula. And also we mentioned that Jordan is now out of the fight. What does this mean for the Palestinians?
They've got no support, no outside support. So Gaza, obviously, they could get some help from Egypt.
Correct.
The West Bank, obviously, Jordan.
Yeah, so now both Egypt and Jordan surrender, and Israel is able to storm into Al-Aqsa, the lands of the Anbiya, the lands which up until then, hitherto, had been under the custodianship of the Jordanians. They had ensured that these massacres would not happen. So the compound of the third holiest site in Islam is now desecrated, and it now becomes an intense battleground during the 6-day war. And the IDF parade throughout the old city of Jerusalem, thus beginning the occupation of the West Bank, an occupation which we still bear the brunt of till this very day. I'm going to allow you to have a look at the footage, the archival footage. This is the compound of Al-Aqsa, so those that have been there, you can recognize these places.
This is Victory Day in Jewish Jerusalem, the day the winners of the battle for the Holy City return through the Mandelbaum Gate to the cheers and the tears of their fellow Israelis.
This morning the airplanes came in and the tanks came and they completely blasted the old city, and then the finest thing that we saw was our troops marching into the old city, and all of us, although we hadn't really, we'd all been fighting ourselves, but these were the guys who'd really gone into the old city after 20 years. This was something we'd been waiting for. It'd been a thorn in our side, and you've got no idea, to be a Jew and not to have the old city in our hands is something which is unexplicable. Not easy to explain.
Now Syria is the only Arab nation left in the fight, and they put up a fierce fight against the Israeli incursions. And you have now the war front moving from the Sinai and also the West Bank and Gaza to the Golan Heights. And so like I said, the Syrians are putting up a fierce fight and they're doing pretty well. But unfortunately, the defense minister of Syria decides in a complete blunder to surrender. They were on the offensive, but they decide to surrender. And this defense minister, does anybody know his name? The defense minister's name was Hafiz al-Assad, Bashar al-Assad, the current leader of Syria's dad. So he makes this huge blunder by surrendering to the Israelis, and thus the Israelis then move into the Golan Heights. Until this very day, Israel occupies the south of Syria, the Golan Heights, this strategic advantage point. Till today, how many of us know that Israel till today occupies the south of Syria? And so everything, my dear brothers and sisters, we see unfolding today in Al-Aqsa and Gaza today was because of these unforgivable, unforgettable 6 days. Egypt is driven out of Gaza and Jordan out of the West Bank, and this is where the Naksa commences. Not the Nakba, the Naksa. The Naksa translates to the setback. And now we have the expelled Palestinian population increasing to 430,000. So after the 1967 Six-Day War, 430,000 Palestinians are expelled from the lands of the West Bank and Gaza. And Moshe Dayan, the defense minister, once again the guy with the eye patch, you might have seen him before, he says, "I hope they all go. If we could achieve the departure of 300,000 without pressure, that would be a great blessing." And since 1967, Our Al-Aqsa has been under siege. Our Al-Aqsa has become the hostage, with several attempts to bulldoze the entire Temple Mount, where Al-Aqsa and the Qibli Masjid and the Dome of the Rock are. They've made attempts to demolish and bulldoze it in replace of the third temple of Solomon. This is their prophecy. After thousands of years, the Jews had successfully done it. They had reached once again the holy city of Jerusalem. Up until this point, they haven't had control over the old city. They've only had control over the regions outside. But now the Jewish people have stormed back into the lands, the prophesied lands. This was prophesied in their Torah. And so since the loss of these lands, Israeli terror attacks in Jerusalem have skyrocketed. In 1969, a man walks into Al-Aqsa and indiscriminately mows down people with his gun, people who are worshipping, and then he blows up the minaret, the mimbar, and he burns it until today. That mimbar had stood since the time of Salah ad-Din, and he burns it. And so we have a bunch of other attacks, the incursions of the IDF every Ramadan, and also in Masjid Khalil in Hebron. For those that have been to Masjid Khalil in Hebron, it's in the West Bank. This is where Ibrahim alayhi salam is buried. This is one of the most authenticated burial grounds of any prophet after Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And they moved into this masjid in Hebron, and they occupied half of the masjid. So till today, and actually on some occasions, they go into this mosque and they start dancing, celebrating, jumping up and down with their blasting music, desecrating the Jamaat Khan of this sacred holy mosque. And in fact, I believe in the 1990s or the 1980s, a terrorist would walk into this mosque, similar how the terrorist walked into Al-Aqsa, and mowed down about 30 to 40 Muslims worshipping there. Until today, that person is celebrated in Israel. Not just by a few people, a small minority. Majority of the Zionists in Israel today support and actually celebrate what this man did. This indiscriminate killing of Palestinians, this terrorist attack, that's what it is. So the Israelis today, they have, this is another image I wanted to mention. So I was in Palestine and I snapped this picture of one of the gates going into the old city of Jerusalem. As you can see, what are these? What are these? Bullet holes, yeah. So this is where we see the intense fighting in the old city of Jerusalem. And this is the calligraphy that you see from, I don't know when exactly the calligraphy is from, but it's probably a couple hundreds, maybe even 1,000 years old. And the calligraphy is Arabic, and it's probably some Quran ayats. And they shot the entire wall. But the divine decree enabled that the only remnants of this calligraphy, those words were Allahu Akbar. So the Israelis can think that they've accomplished this huge military, a miraculous achievement, but in the end of the day, Allah is greater than all that which they think they are. In Israel today, they argue that the 6-day war was a war for Israel's survival. It's this weird claim to make. And they say that Israel's annexation of the entirety of the lands of Palestine, including Jerusalem and Gaza, was out of self-defense. And this is quite objectively false, because firstly, Israel were the perpetrators. We mentioned that they were the ones that attacked first. And so you have online a fella, I can't even call him fella, but this guy beginning with the letter B, he's a Jew, he's a Zionist, and he's made videos arguing that the 1967 war was to preempt the Arab incursions. He states that Nasser was about to commit a genocide against the Jews. There's going to be the second Holocaust in the Arab world. This is once again completely a farce, and it's actually debunked by Israeli officials themselves. So we're going to have a look at these myths, because it's important. If you're online or on Instagram and you want to debate somebody, it's important to understand the nuances of the 1967 war. So, firstly, according to American intelligence, under President LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson, this is the president of America during this time, he says, it was our best judgment that an Egyptian UAR attack was not imminent. And then Major General Metityahu Peled, he's a major of the IDF at the time, and he later recalls the thesis, this is important to note, the thesis according to which the danger of genocide hung over Israel in June 1967 was nothing but a bluff which was born and bred after the war. And Yitzhak Rabin, the army chief of staff, instead, he declares that the moment is coming when we will march on Damascus to overthrow the Syrian government. This is not defensive, this is offensive. So it's funny how the IDF is called the Israeli Defense Force. It's the Israeli offensive force. And so this is evident. This evidently depicts the Six-Day War to be opportunistic, expansionist, and a war aimed to topple Israel's neighbors. So we have the first one, which is the legitimate war of survival. The second myth is it was an expansionist war, and the third myth is, of course, Egypt was about to invade, which, once again, that wasn't the case. So I want to draw your attention now, before we have the 2-minute break, to another specific event which takes place during this time. And I guarantee all of you in this room have never heard of this event, and there's a good reason and a good explanation of why you've never heard of it. So as mentioned at the beginning, Israel begins to block the intelligence, the American intelligence in Israel, to ensure that the Americans weren't aware of what was going to happen. So the Americans now need to get intelligence. So what do? They send a US vessel into the port just off the coast of the Sinai Peninsula in order to gather intelligence themselves. And so on a daily basis, Israeli jets would swoop by this American vessel. It's clearly an American vessel. You can see the numerals, you can see the flag, which would have been raised. And the Israeli jet would fly by this American vessel, and they would wave at the passengers and the US servicemen on the deck. You know, they're probably chilling in the sun, sunbathing, and they can clearly see that this is an American vessel. And they would do this every day. They would go by, swoop by, wave at the people, and then make a routine check, basically. But things would be a little bit different on the 8th of June, 1967. As the war is 2 days from being over, Israeli jets fly by the ship, and they confirm that this was indeed an American ship. There's audio recording where they recognize that this is indeed an American ship, and so 2 Israeli jets fly over one more time, but this time they begin to unload their turrets, their munitions, their artillery onto the deck of the ship. And now, within a split second, these Americans who are sunbathing in the Red Sea, in the Mediterranean Sea, now in a split second they are turned into red vapor. You know, the entire deck is filled with body parts, limbs, blood streaming from the deck of the ship. But the Israeli jets were not finished, because they needed to clear any evidence of their crime. So then they fly over one more time, and this time they drop napalm. Napalm on a ship. Never in the history of warfare has napalm ever been dropped on a ship. Napalm, for those who don't know, is a bomb that when it explodes, it completely engulfs everything in flames. And the Americans used it in Vietnam to extinguish forestry and entire villages in Vietnam. And so the Israelis are using napalm on a US vessel. Can you imagine this? To ensure that whatever was on that vessel was completely erased from memory. And so the Israeli jets, after doing this, they begin to jam the communications of the ship to their mothership so that they could not ask for help or request help or backup. And so 164 of these US servicemen were wounded, and 34 were mauled to bits by the heavy munition, and the whole ship was covered in blood and dismembered limbs. And you see, this was an American vessel. And as we mentioned, because Israel, this is after it's bombed Egypt, and it wants to expand the war frontier where? The Golan Heights. They want to expand the war frontier in Syria. They've defeated Jordan, they defeated Egypt, they want to move to Syria now. So, by ensuring that this ship was destroyed, they could ensure that nobody would challenge their expansion of the war frontier into Syria, essentially. So this was the reason why an Israeli Air Force jet destroyed this American vessel. You're probably wondering, why am I mentioning this? How is this relevant to anything? Well, because instead of American government actually reprimanding Israel for this deliberate, merciless killing of US servicemen, it actually has the contrary effect. So now the president at the time, Lyndon B. Johnson, he wants to, this guy here, he wants to actually hold Israel accountable for what they've done. They've killed US servicemen. Can you imagine? And so he begins to speak with his advisors. But then the Israeli government, according to Israeli documents, they attest that the Israelis would then charge him with blood libel and anti-Semitism, this default fallback position. Hang on, why would you ever blame us for killing your soldiers? We would never do that. Wait, hang on, it was a jet, and there's no jets left in the Arab world, so there can only be one person, and that's you, Israel. And so they charge him with anti-Semitism, and they essentially blackmail him. And so Lyndon B. Johnson, he's like, oh, sugar, because I want to become president again. I want to run for the second term of the president of America. But I can't do that without the backing of the Israelis. We have in Washington, we have the Israeli lobby, for anybody that knows. Essentially a massive lobby group that essentially funds these presidential campaigns. So Lyndon B. Johnson, according to his advisors, said that he couldn't reprimand the Israelis because if he would, then it would limit his chances of gaining funds to be able to run once again for the presidency. And so essentially his career would be over if he did reprimand the Israelis. And so President Johnson was forced to concede and give in to Israel. And in that same year, bear in mind, up until this point, the Americans hadn't actually really been that involved with Israel. But everything we see today, the $4 billion that is loaned to Israel every single year, stemmed from this very moment. That same year, the year that the Americans were attacked by Israel, aid to Israel increased 400%. 4 times Israel was given more aid. And so the US government go into total lockdown. The people that died on the ship were not given a proper burial. The people that survived, the families who had their husbands and their brothers slaughtered mercilessly, they weren't even able to report on the matter. And it was sidelined, relegated to the trash can of history. And that is one of the reasons why we don't know about this event till today. And so even with the people that survived and they had their arms chopped off and their limbs dismembered, when they were given their awards, because this is a custom to have these people awarded, for the first time in US history, they were not awarded on television. They were brought to a little small dingy room and they were given their small little medal. And then they said, okay, thanks for your service. Thanks for losing your limbs for the nation. And then they were relegated and they were not allowed to speak about this atrocious act. So this just goes to show the power, the influence that Israel has on nations like the Americas. So if Israel is allowed to bomb a US ship and kill US servicemen and aid only increasing, what is stopping it from bombing a hospital in Gaza or in the Middle East somewhere, or bombing a UN safe zone, or even bombing an aid truck? Nothing is stopping it. We're gonna have our 2-minute break. Okay, so the 1967 war is now officially over, and the Arab world is humiliated. Nasser is devastated. This is the worst atrocity that has unfolded upon Nasser's government and the Egyptian people. And now Nasser actually resigns in 1967 after this huge blunder. I mean, the Arab world is left completely defenseless. It's probably one of the most humiliating events of the Muslim world after 1945. And so Nasser then, he resigns. But the people would actually plead for him to return. So the man with the dream, the man who wanted to unite the Arab world, was then called back to be the leader of Egypt. The people had called him on. This is like one of the most unprecedented events in politics. You know, he resigned, but the people wanted him back. So Nasser comes back to politics, and they realized, the Arab world realized, that similarly after 1948, what happened in 1948? The creation of Israel and the expelled people, the Nakba. And so similarly after 1948, now after 1967, there was a need for Arab redemption. There was a need for Arab revival, you could say. And thus begins, I think it's like the third Arab redemption and the revival. And you have the figures on screen. King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, he would be vocal against Zionism, and he's probably one of the best Saudi leaders during the 1970s. Absolutely incredible, respectable human being. And during this time, from 1969 right up until his assassination in 1975, he would be vocal against the Palestinian cause, which is very, very rare for a Saudi ruler, and in fact an Arab ruler, to be honest. He was actually assassinated because of his open criticism against Zionism and the acts that we're going to get onto that he did to ensure that Zionism would no longer be a thing. And then of course we have Nasser, but unfortunately Nasser dies. He would end up dying of natural causes in 1970, and he was replaced with Anwar Sadat. We of course have Saddam Hussein, of course he needs no introduction, and then Hafiz al-Assad of Syria. He's not on there, I don't know why I didn't put him there. And also we have Gamal, what's his name? Colonel Gaddafi. Forgot his name. And they would be the populist leaders, the strongmen of the Arab world. You can call them the Avengers if you want. The people that wanted to take back the lands of Palestine from the Israelis. Pay attention, please.
الضمير العالمي أين هو الضمير العالمي؟ إن القدس الشريف يناديكم ويستغيثكم أيها الأخوة لتنقذوه من محنته ومن ابتلي به. فماذا يخيفنا؟ هل نخشى الموت؟ وهل هناك موتة أفضل وأكرم من أن يموت الإنسان مجاهدا في سبيل الله؟
So Nasser, up until his death, would refuse to bargain for the Sinai Peninsula. He said that there's only one solution, and this is another military occupation. This is another large-scale war between the Arabs and the Israelis. And so Israel during this time is enticing him. Look, Nasser, if you accept that we are a nation, if you accept that we're an independent nation and you recognize Israel, then we'll give you the entirety of the Sinai Peninsula. Why would Israel just seemingly hand over the Sinai Peninsula? Well, because it needs peace. It has realized that it can't keep waging these wars of offensive wars. It needs to have long-term peace. And so Nasser, he responds to these claims by going, brother, yeah, I'm going to do this. So he then meets the Arab leaders at Khartoum. This is literally where the Avengers assemble. You have Gamal Abdel Nasser, you have King Faisal, I'm pretty sure Gaddafi's in there somewhere, and they recognize that these 13 Arab leaders would recognize the three no's. The three no's are, number one, no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, and no negotiations with Israel. And this would become, like I said, known as the three no's. So now that peace was not an option, on the 6th of October 1973, the Arabs needed to launch a surprise attack against the Israelis to take back the lands that they lost in 1967. And so on October 6th, 1973, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, Yom Kippur, the Egyptians and the Syrians launched their surprise attack against Israel to reclaim the lost territory, and thus commences the Fourth Arab-Israeli War, or the 1973 Yom Kippur War. And Israel were completely caught off guard, completely. Israel's previous victory in the Six-Day War essentially gave them this false sense of security. They thought that they were invincible. They thought that they could never be challenged ever again. And so this surprise attack, this offensive from the Arabs, sweep Israel off its feet and essentially shatter these grand delusions of the Israeli invincibility. So the Egyptians begin their assault, and they begin to retake the Sinai Peninsula. And while they ultimately were ineffective in driving out the IDF, Egypt's initial success had warranted Israel to reach for the negotiating table, purely out of fear that this surprise attack had instilled within the Israeli cabinet. And so in Syria, similar events happen. Now, unfortunately, the Syrians weren't able to take back the Golan Heights. That is why Golan Heights are still under Israeli occupation. They put up a fierce fight once again, but it wasn't enough to take back the entirety of the Golan Heights. So because the USSR heavily armed Egypt and backed its assault, the US also sought the need to back Israel against the Egyptians, because the US saw this as an opportunity. Up until this moment in time, as we mentioned, after 1967, this is where we see the increased intensification of US aid to Israel. And so the US thought that if we could supply Israel with US munitions, US weapons, tanks, we can test our weapons against the Soviets in the event of a war against the Soviet Union and the Americans. So this became like a hotbed of the Cold War rivalries. And so the Soviets are supporting the Arabs, and the US are heavily supporting the Israelis. And it's one of the reasons why Israel was actually able to defend against not only the Egyptians, but also the Syrians. And it was purely the responsibility of the US and their arms which prevented the collapse of the Israeli regime. So to protest against US participation in the war, the OPEC nations came together. Does anybody know what the OPEC nations are? What's OPEC? OPEC, come on. Yeah. So essentially, they're like, most of them are Arab nations that organize the flow of oil across the world. And so to to protest against the US participation in the 1973 Yom Kippur War, the OPEC nations who produced approximately 55% of global oil, so this is like almost half, more than half of the global oil, they decide to place an oil embargo against any country supporting Israel during this time. And it was devastating to Western economies. Like I said earlier, if there's one thing the US cannot live without, it's oil and trade. You know, when Gamal Abdel Nasser stopped the Tiran Straits, it was damaging to Israeli maritime trade. That's why the war happened in the first place. So this was damaging. Gasoline prices in the US increased at 350%. And in Europe on Sundays, you were banned from actually driving your car at certain times, and you weren't allowed to catch planes. And of course, in the Netherlands, there were energy rations. So the Americans, even though it was helping Israel win on the battlefield, on the international stage, the Arabs were definitely winning. And this oil embargo was the doings and the workings of King Faisal, as we mentioned, in the 1970s. So it was for this reason, for this unbearable pain to be uplifted, the Americans needed to coerce Israel to relinquish its control of the Sinai Peninsula and to actually push for the negotiating table. So people today are saying, violence is not a solution. The Arabs don't need to send in their tanks to attack Israel. Of course, yeah, but there's also other ways which the Arab nations can actually support the cause of the Palestinians. This being a perfect example. It doesn't harm anybody. There's nobody that dies in this. And it clearly worked, and it happened. And it was one of the reasons why Israel was able to, the Egyptians were able to reverse the failures of the initial stages of the war. Also, I hate this pillar. I have to peek over the pillar. It's annoying. So it also goes to show how far we've come in history. Not just one single Arab nation has proposed an oil embargo against the Israelis. So after huge international pressure, so this is the timeline so far. So we've had the first 1948 war, which was the second lecture. Then we had the Suez Crisis, which was also the second lecture. Then this is the Six-Day War, and then the Yom Kippur War. So we've had 4 Arab-Israeli conflicts by this time. These are all the events we're going to discuss in the short time that we have. So now we have the peace negotiations. So Israel is once again coerced into relinquishing their control over the Sinai Peninsula, and in 1973, the war had essentially emphasized Israel's need for, to secure long-term peace. And it knew it could no longer handle the smoke, essentially. So therefore, in 1979, Egypt would become the first Arab country in history to recognize Israel in exchange for the Sinai Peninsula. And Egypt's normalization with Israel was a watershed moment in Palestinian history. Now we have Egypt recognizing Israel. So Egypt, up until this point, had been, the bastion of Palestinian resistance. Now they're completely out of the fight. They have recognized Israel, and no longer would they ever support the Palestinian movements against the Israeli occupation. And so it set a precedent, which even till today we see. So by Egypt recognizing Israel, it would get its land back. They didn't care about the Palestinians, it just wanted the Sinai Peninsula back. And even till today we have countries like Morocco recognizing Israel, and it's set a dangerous precedent which other Arab nations have followed ever since. So the Yom Kippur War is over, and Israel appears to have lost its strategic authority and its superiority, but of course it still has one final wild card it can play to threaten its Arab neighbors. That of course was WMD's nuclear weapons. So Israel's nuclear proliferation can be dated back to the 1950s. Essentially both South Africa and Israel, funnily enough both are apartheid regimes, they stole nuclear secrets off the British and French. Yeah, the British and French at this time would actually be abetting their nuclear program. So in the 1950s, France sends thousands of workers and advisors to Israel to help them create a nuclear bomb. I mean, to be honest, during this time, France is practically helping every single dictatorship. France is also supporting Saddam Hussein in the 1980s. So I was in Iraq and I went to a tank graveyard where you have all the remnants of Saddam Hussein's military and all his tanks. And when you go to this tank graveyard, they're not Iraqi-made tanks, they're not Arab-made, they're actually French-made. So France is essentially helping every single dictator during this time. So it's not surprising that it's helping Israel get nuclear weapons. And once Israel gets the bomb, they have the doctrine called the Begin Doctrine of 1981. It was named after the Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, and it essentially outlined Israel's intention to carry out preemptive strikes against any Arab nation attempting to create a nuclear bomb. So any nation within the Middle East that was trying to create a nuclear bomb, Israel had this doctrine that would target these nuclear plantations. So in 1981, in the Osirak plantation in Iraq, that Saddam Hussein was trying to build a nuclear weapon, the Israelis would literally just fly their jets into sovereign airspace and bomb the Osirak plantation, ensuring that Saddam would never have a nuclear weapon. And it would do the same recent times. In 2007, September, Israel bombs Syria at the Al Kippur nuclear reactor, and these examples can continue. And it's very hypocritical that Israel is allowed to illegally move into these Arab countries. These are sovereign borders, by the way. You can't just move into a nation and just bomb them. But this is what Israel is doing, and it's essentially what the Americans do across the whole world. Invading and, oh, hang on, you can't do that. Only we can have nuclear bombs. Wait, you're the only person that's ever used nuclear bombs. So it's very hypocritical that Israel at this time are waging wars, not wars, but skirmishes and attacking Arab nations and provoking them and ensuring that they don't have the nuclear weapon. Meanwhile, you're probably wondering, what happens now to Gaza and the West Bank? We're almost finishing our chapter here. So what happens to Gaza and the West Bank after 1973? Well, essentially, Israel grants them a degree of autonomy. It's not complete autonomy, and they are still under Israeli occupation. And so now we have the emergence of the PLO, the Palestinian Authority, and its representative was, of course, who was it? Arafat, yes, Yasser Arafat, yeah. And so they are situated in West Bank, and then they were pushed out to Jordan, and they were positioned in Jordan. But unfortunately, during the 1970s, there's a skirmish between the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority and the Jordanian government, and then they were forced to be expelled from the lands of Jordan, and then they made refuge into Lebanon. So in Lebanon, the PLO would continue their activity for a two-state solution, or greater degree of autonomy for the Palestinians in the West Bank. And they would carry out regular air raids, and they would take Israeli hostages. And just like on October 7th, the IDF took this as the perfect opportunity to expand their borders into what is now the south of Lebanon. Once again, we mentioned how the Palestinian Authority had to move to Lebanon, so their headquarters are in Lebanon right now. So just 5 years after the Yom Kippur War, Israel begins the invasion of Lebanon in, I believe it's 1978, and massacres, huge massacres are committed, and the invasion of Lebanon was criticized by the international community. It was actually illegal, it was expansionist, it was illegal, and it was provocative. Yet of course nothing was done about it. And rather than withdrawing, Israel would occupy the south of Lebanon from around 1982 all the way till recent times in the early 2000s, where it then decided to give up these lands. So the capital of Lebanon, which is Beirut was absolutely decimated. It was reduced to rubble, and it's one of the reasons why today we see huge turmoil in that country, economic disparity, because of the Israeli incursions into Beirut. They besieged it, they bombed it relentlessly, and the south of Lebanon today are still being bombed. And so that's why we see the emergence of Hezbollah, the organization which are backed by Iran, that attempt to punish Israel for what it did in the 1980s and the early 2000s. And so just one anecdote of the Israeli crimes committed in this country, the Israelis would get a Christian phalangist movement. So these are fascist-inspired Christians in Lebanon, because Lebanon's a very diverse country. So they get the Christian militias to carry out their dirty work on the ground. So in one refugee camp alone, a UN refugee camp, 400 to 700 would be massacred in this refugee camp. So once Israel achieved its aim of expelling the PLO, who would then flee and make their headquarters in Libya, it withdrew from mainland Lebanon, replacing the government with a pro-Israeli government. This is what they had already wanted. This idea of invading the Arab world and then placing their own pro-Israeli government into these regions. So Israel would still occupy, like I mentioned, the south region of Lebanon right up until the early 2000s. And it was for this reason that we see today the bombing of the southern territories of Lebanon. So slowly but surely, the map of Greater Israel is beginning to expand and contract, but this idea of invading the Arab countries to bring them to their knees has been essentially achieved. They've accomplished their goals of creating a greater Israeli state. Sure, they might not have control over Lebanon, but they most certainly have political control over these regions. So this brings us roughly to where we are today. After the 1980s, there is a new chapter a chapter of betrayal, a chapter where we see the Palestinians, having lost all hope in their brothers Egypt and Jordan and Syria, they now begin to fight alone desperately for themselves. And in the 1990s, we have the first Intifada, the uprisings against the Israeli occupation. And then we have the second Intifada in the 2000s, a silent cry for help, a silent cry that was drowned by the normalization agreements between Israel and its neighbors. And Gaza was then put under siege in 2007, as we all know, and the settlements on the West Bank were ever increasing. The future is looking the bleakest as it has ever been. But the main focus of these lectures, I'm sure, will already have been made apparent. Right from the inception of Zionism, the desire to establish a Zionist homeland, to the British mandate of Palestine, the deep-rooted desire to depose the Caliphate and to divide the Muslim Arab world, all the way to the Nakba and the expansionist wars Israel has waged against its neighbors. And now the normalization, the betrayal of the Palestinian cause and the degradation of the Palestinians' rights. All of these events, my brothers and sisters, demonstrate to us that the struggle for this sliver of land, Palestine, will not be over soon. It is not a struggle that will change overnight. It has been a struggle that has continued for decades and will continue. This is the longest occupation in modern history. Why? Because we haven't given up on the Palestinians. We are not and will never give up. Many nations have been engulfed by settler colonial states, and many nations have been erased from the map, erased from history. And you and I will not let Palestine follow the same fate. So for as long as we hold on to the importance of this blessed land, not just in our minds, but in our hearts, by visiting Al-Aqsa, keeping the discussion alive, for as long as we never relinquish the historical memory and the collective pain of the Palestinians for the past century, our struggle for freedom will never be surrendered. Long live Palestine, long live Gaza, long live the Ummah. Jazakallah khair.